So I am really excited to be live on site in the AVI Systems headquarters in San Diego, California. Gorgeous sunny day. Joined with Brad Souza, the CTO. Good to see you, Brad.
Excited to be here with you.
Every time Brad and I get together, it's a great conversation.
That's right.
I tell you, I learn something new all the time.
Oh,
and
likewise.
So we're thrilled. Today's session is brought to you by Bose Professional and AVI Systems. And we are exploring the topic of some of the transformation, trends, changes that are occurring in the education sector. But before we go too far into that, Brad, I want to start with a brief introduction from you. How did you get into the AV industry? How did you get your start?
Yeah, it's I guess my introduction into AV or this side of the technology space is like many of us. I didn't plan it. I just kind of fell in it, and it started back, quite honestly, in 1980 something, 1990 something, back in the day. It was in the day where we were really trying to solve the problem of how do you transport or send around high-res video over fiber. And then from there kind of progressed into integration. And all the way along the line, I guess the common thread for me was really how does this change the way people live or consume technology or do their work? That's kind of the big thing for me.
You just did a very technical description of yourself, but I know I know the truth. There is another side to Brad Souza, a very creative side that most people don't know.
That's true.
So there was a place you stopped before you got into the super techie side. So talk a little bit about your creative roots.
And so I think what you're asking is maybe around marketing, or are you asking around music, or both?
Yes and yes. The reality is, everybody's education journey starts in different places, and it evolves. And you are one of the most technically competent people I've ever met, but you also have this really strong creative side that I think makes you truly a unique CTO.
Yeah, well, thanks, man. So, I have definitely a creative side that comes out sometimes in terms of music. I play. I went to college on a bass guitar scholarship that helped kind of pay my way through school, and I continue to play now. I play whenever I get a chance to do it. I play bass guitar.
That's great.
And in the early part of my career, it wasn't really around tech. It was really around strategic positioning, around understanding how to connect to how people think and react to messaging and that kind of stuff. So there's this marketing and strategy thing combined with this music thing and this super geeky love for tech, and that's kind of how I got to where I am.
So somebody's watching and listening to this today, and they're thinking to themselves, how do I chart my course, my career in an industry? Yours has been very non-circuitous, right? I played bass guitar, but I never got that smart. The name of my band was Noisy Crud. That speaks volumes right there. But what advice would you have for someone that's charting a course, maybe earlier in their career, and they're thinking about, how do I sit in a Brad Souza seat one day?
Yeah, I guess maybe there's two things. One is if you're not passionate about it, then why do it? And there's a real passion. A lot of people think of AV as that guy that's kind of pushing the cart down the hallway at a school somewhere, but AV to me today is the single coolest sector in IT, because everything is consumed through how you see it and how you hear it. Whereas maybe 2 or 3 generations ago, it was consumed through how I read it. But today, everything is consumed through the eyes and the ears.
Totally.
And as a result of that, the technology is so fast and developing.
Right.
I tell people that the product life cycle is like 6 months. So you have to be super passionate about it. And find that passion. The second thing is, I think I would really say that if you're a little fearful about getting in, or maybe you don't have a sense that you really understand it, focus on 2 things. One is find an element that you're passionate about and become an expert in it, because the technology is going to change in 6 months, and you could actually become an expert in whatever the new thing is pretty fast.
Wow. Yeah.
And study how it impacts people. And if you do that, that's where I think the real leadership comes these days.
Yeah, that's great advice, and that's really good insight. So we're going to explore the learning experience in general.
Yeah.
And I know it's very different from when you and I both went to school.
Yeah,
It's
right.
changed a lot, right?
Sure has.
So what's got you excited now about the changes, the transformation, the trends that are happening in the education sector?
Yeah, so the way education or pedagogy, the way that instruction is being delivered today is so different. And I find that fascinating. And part of that's driven through changes in technology, and part of that's driven through generational differences and expectations on how people learn. So just the transformation in how you do instructional delivery is really huge, fascinating to me. The second part about this is that the higher ed business as a whole, if I call it a business, is really under huge pressure. Lots of external pressure, around the finances of going to school. What's the practical output or outcome of going to school? How do I apply that to real world experiences? And that's transforming public partner partnerships and spatial planning and all those other kinds of things. And then lastly, because of the cost of going to school, one of the things that we're seeing is just really dramatic changes in how universities, colleges recruit. I mean, do they recruit straight out of high school? Do they recruit from the workforce? Can I create a lifelong learning model and I never actually get done with going to school, right? It's just extended into my workplace. All of these kinds of things we think are super interesting trends, and we think that they have a direct impact to the technologies that are being used.
Absolutely, and they're absolutely changing strategically how an institution or an educational group might be looking at how they deliver capabilities into the future.
Yeah.
I think both of us have had kids that have gone to college recently, and as we're looking back in those experiences, I would 100% corroborate that the learning experience is very different today than what it was. So let's jump into the first one.
Okay.
You talked about active learning and the pedagogy of the classroom experience. I want you to describe at a high level how that experience is changing. And as opposed to maybe looking at it over the last 20 years or the last 10 years, just take me into maybe even the last 3 to 5 years. What are those major shifts?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. It's fascinating to me. And I love it when I have an opportunity to speak at a college or a university or contribute maybe to the learning process. I love it. And one of the things I think that has really transitioned is this idea that instruction used to be this expert at the front of the room that was ingratiating all the students and passing on their years of knowledge and experience. And today it's not what it's like at all. I mean, the more progressive schools are really around this idea of active learning, and it's how do students interact with each other, and the ability not to just transfer information and knowledge, but the ability to apply it. And the way that you kind of measure whether a student gets it or not is their ability to transfer it to somebody else. So it's not the professor transferring it to the students in the case of higher ed. It's the students transferring it to the other, and the professor or the teacher is kind of facilitating this environment that allows them to self-learn, self-experience, and then transfer and work with that knowledge with each other. And that's become the kind of the definition of learning today.
So in that environment, would you say that the teacher today versus the teacher of maybe 10 or 20 years ago has a greater responsibility in facilitation? Is it a newer skill, or has it always been there, but it's just become more of a hard, fast requirement today?
Yeah. So I think, I don't know if it's in a years of experience or a years in terms of generations, but there's a lot of debate in that today. There's still a lot of emphasis on the traditional classroom, and the way that we make money is to put butts in seats, and the way a professor makes money is they get paid to teach, but then I also have all of these books I've written, and you buy these books, and that's kind of the economy. And that still is super common. But those students that seem to be really excelling and learning more is when that teacher recognizes that knowledge is available on your phone.
Right.
Knowledge is available everywhere. My purpose as a teacher is to really help you sift through that knowledge and then find a way to apply it.
Right.
And that's the whole active learning kind of thought process there, is really around how do I apply that knowledge as opposed to how do I find it.
So in an environment like that, where the experiences become much more active, does it put new demands on the student?
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah.
Are they different than the way they used to be?
Yeah, I think it puts new demands on them. I think that there's a different set of expectations from the student. I think the student, the demand on the student is probably to be much more of an independent learner, as opposed to receive that instruction from a teacher. I think the expectation also is that learning experience is very interactive.
Right.
It's not just contained inside the four walls of this room.
Right.
So maybe I can give you an example of what that might look like. So we were doing a project, I was involved in a project with a large healthcare provider. And for us at the healthcare provider, it looked like a bunch of conferencing and executive meeting spaces. And of course, it's all UC enabled, and it's, it has very dynamic seating arrangements and all of that kind of stuff. But we saw it more as a professional development, learning environment, executive briefing center. And you can kind of imagine what that might look like.
Right, yeah.
At the same time, unknown to us, or at the same time, we're building distance learning centers for different schools of nursing within a state university. What we didn't know was that those distance learning schools or sites were actually instructing students in the conference rooms that we were building on the site of that healthcare provider. So that ability for that state university to extend their learning environment into the work environment really had a really huge shift, not only on the way that people learned, but it had a huge shift on a problem that they were facing in the state, which was a limitation on the number of certified nurses.
Fascinating.
Right? So they were able to actually shift an economy as a result of extended learning.
Where does an idea like that begin within an institution? So does a problem like that addressed from administration? Is it addressed from the teacher? Is it the student bringing a new demand forward? Or is it a partnership potentially where they're looking for some thought leadership? And how does a conversation like that even get ignited?
Yeah, so that was pretty transformational, right?
Right.
Today, we're seeing more of that, but in the early stages, that was super transformational, which meant that somebody had to push a rock uphill.
Right.
Which meant that somebody had to have the passion to believe that there was goodness for people if I did this. So I'm willing to kind of pay the price to create transformation. In the case of the project that I'm talking about, there's clearly this public-private partnership that was going on, but it started on the university side with the leader in that school of nursing saying, "Hey, you know what? The world is changing.
Yeah.
If the only nurses I can reach are those who can make it to my campus,
right.
that's not going to serve the community I want to serve." And so they had the passion and the vision to make that change. And then the healthcare provider recognized, if the only way I can get nurses certified is to send them someplace, the impact on my workforce when there's a limit on the available number of certified nurses, that's going to impact the way I treat patients. Isn't there a way to bring those together? And that's where technology steps in.
That's where technology steps in. So that's a great example of the linkages between, the problem to be solved, the use case, that really created the opportunity for the visionary to move it forward. Are all technology initiatives like that, do they all require visionaries to move them forward? Or do you feel like there's enough of a tipping point now in a category like this around active learning where there's enough data out there to suggest that this really is the method, and clearly it points to a few things organizations should be thinking about?
Yeah. So around the topic of active learning, I want to believe, I hope that we've transitioned from transformative to evolution, right? It's an accepted thought, it's an accepted philosophy on pedagogy and instructional delivery. And now what we're doing is optimizing it. We're evolving it so that it's easier to apply, easier to consume, much more natural to do.
Right.
I think that's true. My intuitively, I want to say that's true. There's a lot of research and studies that seem to indicate that that's true. But there's still a lot of thinking that's much more traditional around. Let's get everybody into a large classroom and do a lecture to 1,000 students.
Yeah. So it's riding sort of two sides right now.
Yep.
So I want you to talk a little bit about the design implication from an AV perspective,
Sure.
an audiovisuals perspective of what are the things that you should be thinking about putting in place to ensure that you can meet today's needs, but also be ready for what's coming around the corner.
Yeah, so let's imagine now that this classroom is really focused on how to create an environment around active learning. And so what that means is that you're probably not going to have a bunch of rows of chairs facing the front of the room. Those chairs are going to be facing each other because those students are engaging actively with each other around whatever the subject matter is that they're learning. That changes the dynamics of just the acoustics of the room, just the physics of the room. It also changes the way that you display and communicate ideas. And by its nature, it's less of a teacher with a laptop going through a PowerPoint very systematically in the front. It's now all of these different students are contributing based upon whatever devices they might have and sharing that information with each other. That notion of itself now requires very different thinking around how you display information, how you capture speech, how you transfer it, because it's not just what's happening in this room. It's probably, that room is probably connected to a half a dozen other rooms at the same time, and they're all interactive. So let me give you an example of what this looks like for a large Midwestern state university, right? The idea for them was we want to create this distance learning environment, but we want to extend or capture and extend this active learning instructional delivery model. Well, if it was the teacher in front of the room or the sage on the stage, super easy to do. Camera in the back of the room, laptop in the front of the room, lapel microphone, and away we go.
Right.
But in this active learning environment, it's very different. So what we did is we created a software control platform. I hesitate to use the word platform, but the idea is that the way that the instructor interacted with the technology was based on their instructional delivery model. So
the model became the critical enabler. That's the shift. Is that the model really is leading, how the technology gets used.
Yep.
Yeah. Who's more ready for this? The instructor, the student, the faculty and administration, IT. Who, if you're looking across the organization, who's the most ready, and who's maybe it's a tough question. Who's the least ready?
Yeah. So I would say that the most ready is the student.
Yeah.
They're hungry to consume it in this kind of environment.
Right.
I would say that the faculty is eager, but maybe not ready, because it changes. For some faculty, it changes the way they do instructional delivery.
Yep.
How they teach is different as a result of this.
Right.
Those teachers that are a little bit more on the front of the bell curve, not maybe early innovators, but early adopters in the front of the curve, they're hungry for it. They're eager for it. So who's least ready for it is probably the IT services. Now, the result of that is that in order for the expectation of the student to be met, that means that the technology has to transfer from early adopter to mainline teacher.
Right.
And the way that we think that that's going to happen is by enabling user control that mimics the way I teach. So multiple classrooms, those classrooms are active learning classrooms. And so the beginning of my class is in a traditional class, the beginning of my class is very chaotic. Students are talking, people are having conversations in sidebar. So what we do is, the very first thing we do is we hit a button that says class start or interaction. And the experience across all classrooms is somewhat chaotic. There's a lot of noise. There's multiple people on all of the monitors and the projection displays. You're not really sure who you're looking at, what classroom they're in.
The class, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yeah, right.
It's just kind of chaotic.
Right.
And then the next thing is maybe the lecture part. And so they tap a button that says lecture. And what that does is it brings all the remote, it begins to gate all the microphones.
Yeah.
It brings all the remote ends to the instructor. But all the remote sites only see the instructor. They don't see each other.
Yeah.
And then there's maybe a next step, which is interaction.
Yeah.
And at that part, now what we're doing is where the teacher has a roster of who's where.
Right.
And they're able to create interaction virtually as well as interaction in the classroom.
I would describe this as you are simplifying to accelerate. Right.
Yeah,
and so,
excellent.
And what you're doing is you're making it so that the instructor can really focus on instruction without having to worry about technology.
Right.
But the technology that's happening there is very complex.
Right. Super complex.
Super complex. And I love the point that the student is probably already doing this or has done this to some degree, already knows how to navigate it to a large degree. So providing a service at the end of the day, IT services like you had referenced for the instructor to be able to deliver and then really adapt to these new models. Great opportunity.
Right.
All right, so what advice would you have for an organization that is headed down this path? They may be super mature or they may be like not even really started here. But if you could give maybe 1 or 2 pointers around this is what you want to start thinking about, these are the things that are important to you, you've got the last word. What would you tell them?
Yeah, so if the organization is defined as the school, the university or the college, what I would really be thinking about is how do you have a conversation with a technology specialist, not around the specs, but around the outcomes that you're trying to achieve and what you want the experience to be.
Right.
And if you can have that conversation around experience and outcomes and allow them to kind of lead the conversation around technology and spec, that's where I think you're going to have the best potential outcome. If what we're talking about is how do you engage with a technology partner, maybe like an AVI, then I think the conversation really needs to start with what's your planning process way before we start doing any kind of engineering. How do we ensure that the result of the engineering and design effort that we're going to do is really going to match up with the use cases and the user expectations that we have? And so that's where the conversation I would really encourage all of it to start at.
Awesome. Outcomes and experiences.
Yes.
We are talking live today with Brad Souza, the CTO of AVI Systems, and we have been exploring this idea of trends and transformations that are happening in the education sector. And we want to thank our sponsors today, Bose Professional and AVI Systems, for hosting today's session. Brad, how does somebody get in touch with your organization?
Yeah, thanks. So it's avisystems.com. That's a place to go. From there, you can navigate into any one of the specialty technologies that we support, any of the markets, including higher ed. And we usually have an office pretty close by, so there's going to be somebody there who wants to talk with you about it.
Great. Thanks, Brad.
Appreciate it.